While others played a game, the Soviets waged war. They didn't just send typical athletes. They deployed soldiers. It was college kids on one side against a superpower on the other. People called it a massacre just waiting to happen, and the entire world believed that narrative. But one eccentric coach understood something nobody else did. The specific game he was building toward nearly triggered World War II. The Soviet Union team arrived at Lake Placid in February 1980 with a track record that made every professional team look like amateurs. Over 4 Olympic cycles spanning from 1964 all the way through 1976. They went 27-1, outscoring opponents 175-44 during that run. 4 straight gold medals hung from their necks. No team had beaten them in an Olympic match since 1968. These weren't just students playing between their classes or blue-collar workers skating after their long shifts. Their hockey program functioned as a military operation that was fully funded by the powerful Kremlin. Every single player on that roster trained 11 months each year under strict state supervision. The Red Army didn't just create athletes, it built lethal weapons on skates. Anchoring this machine was Vladislav Tretiak, widely known as the greatest goalie on the entire planet. He had already secured gold medals in 1972 and 76, and at 28 years old. He was entering his prime with reflexes that made scoring feel like a lucky accident rather than a strategy. The Soviets had outscored their Olympic rivals by massive margins over the last few years, turning international tournaments into displays of raw dominance rather than actual competitive contests. When Soviet coach Viktor Tikhonov looked at the bracket for the Lake Placid Games, he made his harsh assessment very clear to anyone who was listening. It will be a slaughter, but the rink in upstate New York meant more than just sports. The world outside that arena was starting to fall apart. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan 2 months prior, back in December 1979, reigniting fears that the Cold War was spinning out of human control. In Iran, 52 Americans were still hostages on the 102nd day of their captivity. It was a constant reminder that American power had real limits. High inflation crushed family budgets while unemployment rose and gas lines stretched around entire city blocks. The United States was desperately in need of a victory somewhere, and the Kremlin knew that every gold medal won on the ice reinforced the idea that communism worked better than democracy. Hockey became the chosen battlefield because the Soviets had absolutely perfected it. Their players glided across the ice like synchronized machinery, executing plays that showed off years of collective training under their rigid centralized program. American hockey, by comparison, looked weak. It looked messy and underfunded, relying on college teams and individual growth rather than huge state resources. When the official matchup was finally announced, no serious hockey analyst gave the United States a real legitimate chance. The Americans had no hope unless one eccentric coach could somehow pull off the absolute impossible. Herb Brooks had watched the 1960 Olympic team win gold from his living room after being the final player cut from that squad. The cold arena air sets the stage as we gear up to revisit the most legendary scraps and scandals in hockey history. 20 years later, when the Olympic Committee needed a new coach, Brooks kept his pitch very simple. Give me 6 months and players that nobody else wants, and I will beat the Soviets at their game. A heavy, rhythmic pulse mirrors the raw intensity of the hardest hits and the most heartbreaking tragedies the league has ever seen. The committee thought he was crazy, but Brooks had spent a whole decade studying Soviet hockey with the focus of a man preparing for war. He knew their physical conditioning methods. Brooks didn't plan on outmatching the Soviets with pure talent or flashy individual skills. His goal was to outwork them by turning their own tactical system against them. Herb handpicked 20 players averaging 21 years old, the youngest American squad ever assembled. The Soviets averaged 26 years and had already played as a unit for years. The atmosphere at the tryouts was thick with pure desperation and raw, unbridled ambition. He gave 68 hopefuls a 300-question psychological test searching for very specific traits. He needed players willing to bleed for the win when things got heavy and ugly. Mike Eruzione became captain despite having 0 professional hockey prospects in his immediate future. A blue-collar kid from Massachusetts who knew this tournament was his absolute career ceiling, a height he would never reach ever again. Jim Craig played goal while carrying the heavy promise he made to his mother Margaret. She died from cancer in 1977 and never saw him represent his country. Mark Johnson arrived as the coach's kid coming out of the University of Minnesota program. This meant every mistake was scrutinized and every success was labeled as pure nepotism. Brooks had a complex philosophy that left nearly every observer scratching their heads in confusion. I am not looking for the greatest individual players. I am looking for the right ones for this team. Training camp was a systematic dismantling of every hockey rule these kids had ever known. Brooks introduced a soul-crushing skating drill that the boys simply referred to as Herbies. After the squad lacked intensity during a practice, he decided it was time to break them. He skated them until they collapsed and were literally puking all over the cold ice. The whistle didn't stop when they begged. It only stopped on Herb's own command. Brooks needed them to understand that maximum effort was a non-negotiable requirement for success. His assistant coach warned that the players would revolt if he kept pushing them this hard. Brooks just smirked and said, "Good, let them find unity in hating me together." He was building brotherhood through shared agony and absolute physical exhaustion, forcing 20 rivals from different schools to become one single fast-moving, cohesive organism. They moved faster than the Soviets ever imagined Americans could. The boys absolutely loathed him. But inside that shared hatred, they actually started to believe in one another. 3 weeks before the games, Herb had one final psychological test on February 9th, 1980. The Americans faced the Soviet Union at Madison Square Garden for a final exhibition match. The Soviets absolutely demolished the American team 10-3 that night. Over 11,000 fans watched the Russians treat the USA squad like little children. Tretiak stopped every shot like he was playing a game against a bunch of toddlers. Vladimir Krutov scored 3 goals while Jim Craig got yanked after allowing 4 goals. The media ran stories asking what kind of lambs were being slaughtered in Lake Placid. Every fan left the arena convinced the upcoming Olympic game would be a total bloodbath. Everyone except Herb Brooks, who walked out of the arena with a confident smirk. In the locker room afterward, Herb told his confused boys exactly what had happened. He explained the reality of the situation to his shell-shocked and embarrassed young players. "We just showed them exactly what they expected. Herb had told them to play slow. He wanted them to look tired to confirm every Soviet bias about American hockey being inferior." The trap was perfectly set for the Russians. The Soviets would arrive at the games feeling untouchable and completely overconfident in themselves, expecting the same weak, slow American team they had just publicly humiliated in New York. Herb Brooks kept his true strategy under tight wraps to ensure the tactical secret stayed fully contained. During the Olympics, the American boys were set to unleash chaos and skate the Soviets into absolute exhaustion. It was speed over strength and relentless pressure over careful positioning. Every single thing the Soviet scouts had just witnessed was a complete lie. Team USA entered that Olympic tournament ranked as the 7th seed out of 12 teams. They opened against Sweden and trailed until the very final seconds, salvaging a 2-2 tie that kept their hopes alive. 2 days later, they absolutely demolished Czechoslovakia 7-3. This stunned observers because the Czechs were widely considered the 3rd best team in the world. While the Americans were quietly climbing, the Soviet camp was growing fat on their own dominance. They had cruised through their group, outscoring opponents 51-11 across 5 games. Tikhonov watched those American results scroll past without a shred of concern. When someone in his camp noted that the Americans actually looked dangerous, he dismissed it with a wave, saying they should have their fun before we handle them on Friday. The Soviets weren't preparing for a fight, they were preparing for a formality. February 22nd, 1980 arrived with 10,000 Americans packed into the Olympic Fieldhouse at Lake Placid. The Soviets brought their elite A-team, the same roster that had humiliated the professionals and dominated international hockey for over a full decade. Tretiak stood in goal while the 5-man attack that had perfected puck possession finally took the ice. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. The Soviets scored first at 9 minutes 12 seconds when Vladimir Krutov deflected a shot past Jim Craig. The arena went dead quiet, and then the Americans revealed exactly what Brooks was hiding. They skated relentlessly, never once stopping, rotating their lines much faster than the Soviets had ever seen from an American squad. Buzz Schneider tied it at 14-03 with a shot that made Soviet defensemen look at each other in confusion. This definitely was not the team from Madison Square Garden. The Soviets answered when Sergei Makarov scored at 17:34, briefly restoring order. But with only one lone second remaining in the opening period, Mark Johnson pounced on a loose rebound and tied the game at 2-2 as the arena exploded. Soviet coach Viktor Tikhonov made a decision that stunned everyone, pulling Vladislav Tretiak, the finest goaltender on the entire planet, and replaced him with the backup Vladimir Myshkin. The Soviets left the ice looking visibly rattled for the first time in many years. This was the exact moment the game shifted from a hockey match into something else entirely. The second period was where the Americans proved their legendary conditioning was the real deal. Alexander Maltsev scored at 2:18 on a power play, making it 3-2. The Soviets held the lead, but Brooks had built this team specifically for this heavy moment. Trailing under pressure against tired legs on the other side, Jim Craig became a wall. With 15 saves in that period, the Soviets fired everything at him, yet absolutely nothing went in. Soviet players started screaming at each other as the Americans began to hit even harder, and skated faster than any team trained for 11 months should have ever been able to handle. That conditioning wasn't just working, it was actually breaking the Soviet spirit. The third period began with 20 minutes separating those young Americans from making history. At 8:39, Mark Johnson tied it 3-3 on a power play as momentum shifted. With exactly 10 minutes remaining, Mike Eruzione gathered a loose puck near the blue line. He had never scored in a major clutch moment until this very second. He snapped a 25-foot wrist shot that beat Myshkin clean, putting the Americans up 4-3. Now came the intense part nobody discusses with 10 minutes of agony left on the game clock. The Soviets pulled their netminder and sent every man they had crashing into the offensive zone. Jim Craig turned away 6 frantic shots during those final 5 minutes of absolute defensive carnage. It was total chaos, with bodies slamming into him and sticks slashing during every single possession. The crowd erupted into a deafening countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, until the siren finally screamed. Al Michaels shouted into his microphone asking if we believe in miracles before yelling out a yes. Teammates dogpiled Craig while he gazed upward, thinking of his mother who passed in 1977 and missed this. Fans in the rafters wept openly while joining in a thunderous chant of USA, USA, all while the stunned Soviet powerhouse slunk off the ice in a haunting, deafening silence. A global empire suffered a fracture on live television, yet Herb Brooks stubbornly refused to celebrate. The gold wasn't theirs yet, and he knew they could still lose everything in only 2 days. 2 days after the Soviet upset, the United States faced Finland for the actual gold medal prize. After partying all night, several players rolled into the arena nursing heavy hangovers and lacking any real focus. Finland capitalized almost immediately, taking a 2-1 lead into the third while the Americans skated like they already won. Brooks went nuclear during the break, screaming that the team was throwing the whole game away. The locker room turned ice cold and quiet until Mike stood up and dropped the heavy truth that would ultimately save the entire tournament. We just beat the Russians, so let's not be remembered for losing to the Finns. The Americans hammered home 3 unanswered goals in the third, locking up a 4-2 win. It was only then, on February 24th, 1980, that they became true Olympic champions. President Jimmy Carter watched from the White House on day 110 of the hostage crisis. The next morning, Carter told the nation that American grit could accomplish absolutely anything they wanted. He used the hockey game as proof that the United States still had the heart required to compete against even the most impossible odds. National morale shifted overnight in ways that policy speeches and political promises never quite could, had utterly failed before. While the hostage situation remained grim for the first time in months, people believed that hopeless situations could be overcome. The Soviets responded to the loss by blaming the referees and overhauling their entire hockey program, a silent admission that their powerhouse was actually beatable. Russian state media struggled to explain the loss, with one paper suggesting the defeat came from something much harder to measure than player skill. Sports Illustrated editors featured the team on their cover with the permanent headline "Miracle on Ice," later calling it the greatest sports moment of the entire 20th century era. The players returned to ordinary lives, proving that the peak was more significant than the journey home. 13 went to the NHL, though most ended up having fairly average professional careers. Mike Eruzione never played another minute of competitive hockey, walking away at the absolute summit because nothing else could ever top that feeling. Jim Craig carried a folded American flag onto the ice after the gold medal game, a heartbreaking tribute to Margaret. Herb Brooks eventually coached in the NHL before his life was cut short in a 2003 wreck. The unique bond setting this group apart became obvious whenever they gathered together for their reunions. Over 20 players still make the effort to show up and support each other decades later. While most Olympic squads eventually drift apart, this was never just a simple story about sports. This pivotal Cold War moment wore the mask of a simple hockey match. Eventually, the Soviet Empire just crumbled. 11 years later, the Union fell. Hockey didn't cause it, but it revealed deep cracks in a system that seemed invincible. It proved to every nation that pure conviction could shatter rigid systems whenever the pressure reached a breaking point. That final scoreboard on the ice was not the actual miracle. It wasn't Jim Craig's 36 saves or that winning goal by Mike Eruzione. Herb Brooks' coaching tactics aside, the real magic lived in 20 young men who flatly rejected the idea that victory was impossible. That is how a winter sport transformed into a geopolitical tool, making hope the most powerful American product ever exported. They actually managed to topple the Soviets. Afterward, their biggest rivals were their own minds. They spent their lives carrying the heavy mantle of the squad that showed the world miracles actually do exist. Very few of those players ever touched that summit again, but that was never the real point. The goal was proving to a struggling nation that impossible is simply a way of saying not just yet. The rink provided the United States with a new arsenal that afternoon, not aggression or terror, but total belief. If you are searching for gritty tales that refuse to shield legacies or sanitize the messy history of the game, these accounts detail the specific events that reshaped the sport of hockey and the surrounding global landscape. Hit that follow button for the raw truth. We dissect the sport where the official league narrative finally ends.